How much is the newest Nintendo console going to be? It's a topic that pretty much starts as soon as the last Nintendo console releases. Well, look no further. Today we're going to build a handy little cheat sheet to help you guesstimate how much the latest bit of Nintendo hardware is going to be. Just a few rules. We're only going to be looking at major Nintendo platforms and generations, so no accessories and no revisions. Sorry all you color TV stands out there, but we're going to be focusing on the NES all the way to the Switch and every handheld in between to help us find a pattern in Nintendo's pricing strategy. Can you remember how much you spent at every launch? Well, maybe send your wallet out of the room because we're breaking out the inflation calculator, including the Japanese yen exchange prices. Oh yeah, we're getting all sorts of nerdy with the numbers today. So let's get started. The Family Computer or Famicom is the first major Nintendo console with swappable cartridges and eventual third-party support. Priced at 14,800 yen, which is 20,563 yen by today's value, or around $139, the Famicom was a staggeringly good deal, even if President Yamauchi still believed it was slightly overpriced. Why? He wanted children to be able to save their weekly allowance and buy it themselves, which of course still occurred thanks to Masayuki Yumara's ingenious bit of engineering. Launching on July 15, 1983, this console would become massively popular despite some initial quality concerns, thanks to its arcade-fast gameplay. A couple of years later in the United States, we got our very own Nintendo Entertainment System, which again was just the Famicom rebranded to disassociate this new platform with the failed video game systems of the past. It was only 2 years after the 1983 video game crash after all, and this extensive bit of slow marketing integration meant trickling in through the now 5-year-old Nintendo of America, not in their now familiar location of Washington State, but in the cultural hotspot of New York City. And this meant a launch price or even a launch date is widely disputed beyond a vague October 1985 timeframe. Okay, we'll work with it, and the $180 price tag for early packaged consoles. But brace yourself, because today that's $526. So next time someone tells you the newest Nintendo console costs too much, remind them it could always be much, much worse. Up next we have Nintendo's first major handheld, the Game Boy. Sorry, Game & Watch. And unlike the Famicom, this console shared universal branding in both Japan and the United States. But perhaps most surprisingly, it launched mere months apart in Japan and America, an extremely quick turnaround for hardware of this era. Launching on April 21, 1989 for 12,500 yen, that price adjusted for inflation is 16,052 yen or $108.95. On July 31, 1989, Americans would finally get their hands on the Game Boy for the price of $89.99. Or $229 by 2025 standards. This masterpiece designed by Gunpei Yokoi would see support for well over a decade, which is rather impressive because its thrifty price was thanks in large part to its use of withering technology, tech that was already on its last legs compiled together for one last hurrah. Instead, it steamrolled the competition and their much flashier graphics. We're back in Japan for November 21, 1990. That's the start of a new decade and a new console generation for Nintendo and their latest bit of hardware, the Super Famicom. But with new technology comes escalated prices, and the 25,000 yen price tag, or 31,150 yen, which is $211.32 in 2025 money, was notably higher than the Famicom or Game Boy. But they had to make up for the more expensive components, including a remarkably good sound chip produced by their good friends at Sony. Whatever happened to that relationship? Still, players happily snapped up this beloved 16-bit console all throughout the 1990s, and its library is held up to time, with numerous games seeing re-release on Nintendo Switch Online. Let's hop back to the United States for the release of the Super Nintendo on August 23, 1991. This was far from the first follow-up console, and yet there was a growing skepticism by American consumers thanks in large part to the growing popularity of the new Sega Genesis. Still, the Super Nintendo launched with the premium price of $199.99, or $472 in today's money. Is there any chance that the next Nintendo console costs more than $472? I really doubt it. Again, it's a good reminder that video games have always been pretty expensive and they're getting cheaper most generations. After a series of prolonged and public delays, Nintendo finally joined the first proper 3D generation with the Nintendo 64. In fact, the pre-release turbulence caused Nintendo to do a pre-launch price cut, a practice that is still extremely rare to this day. Originally priced at 25,000 yen, Nintendo revised that price to 16,800 yen, which is 19,532 yen after inflation, or $130.41. It's safe to say Japanese consumers got much more of a bargain than us in the West, but we did see a price cut from $250 to $199.99, or a whopping $404.68 in 2025 money. Would you spend $400 just to play Super Mario 64 for the first time? Because honestly, I might. We're back in the handheld space with Nintendo's first new handheld in over a decade. No, we're not talking about the Game Boy Color, but the Game Boy Advance, which is considered a continuation of the Super Nintendo style of games, while Nintendo's home consoles chase the latest and greatest in 3D graphics. Heck, the original GBA didn't even have a backlight, but it still had a 9,800 yen price tag when it launched on March 21st, 2001. And that's 11,326 yen, or $76.91 in dollars. Once again, the Westerners were paying out the nose for this one with a $99.99 price tag, or $178.97 in today's money. Ouch. To some, the Game Boy Advance is the best handheld ever. How about letting us know where you stand in the comments below? There are few consoles as consequential as the GameCube. This is Nintendo's final challenge for technological supremacy, and ever since then returning to their weathering technology strategy that continues to this day. Nintendo were back at their 25,000 yen price point, and this time they weren't budging, which is 28,893 yen, or $196 in today's money. Following the Japanese September release, the GameCube arrived on Western shores on November 18th, 2001 for $199.99. Yep, the same price as the Super Nintendo and Nintendo 64, which is $358 by today's inflation rates. Ultimately, the GameCube would suffer due to stiff competition in the form of Microsoft's Xbox and Sony's PlayStation 2, causing Nintendo to shift creative directions. The Nintendo DS launch is one of the strangest in all of Nintendo history. First of all, Nintendo refused to commit to it as a replacement for the Game Boy Advance, instead referring to it as a third pillar to coexist with the GameCube and Game Boy Advance. Sure, whatever. Tell that to the Virtual Boy. And second of all, it launched in America before Japan. That's right, the Nintendo DS arrived in the States on November 21st, 2004 for $149.99, or $249.48 in 2025 money, with Nintendo eventually releasing the platform on December 2nd, 2004 in Japan for 15,000 yen, or 17,540 yen, or $119 in 2025's exchange rate. Nintendo seriously had such low expectations for the Nintendo DS, they broke their own release patterns and gave it a rather thrifty price. So whatever happened to that third pillar strategy? The money made the pillar fall over. Up next is the behemoth with the funny name, the Nintendo Wii. Seriously, there were so many rumors about what this console would be named, and the Wii didn't even place. But following the surging success of the Nintendo DS and a new president in Satoru Iwata, the company decided to follow the DS's example and release the Nintendo Wii in North America first on November 19th, 2006 for $249.99, or $400.49 by today's standards. Again, is anyone expecting the new Nintendo console to be $400? Really shows you how expensive game consoles have always been, and the Wii was the cheapest one out of the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3. Well, over in Japan, the Wii launched on December 2nd, 2006 for 25,000 yen, or 29,243 yen in today's money, or $198.53. But don't feel like Japan scored a deal here. Over there, the Wii launched without a pack-in game, so they didn't get Wii Sports. Heck, to this day, amateur analysts still argue if Wii Sports being a pack-in game was a good idea, or if Nintendo gave away the golden goose. Let us know what you think in the comments below. Oh boy, here we go. Arguably Nintendo's worst launch ever in the Nintendo 3DS. Now, personally speaking, I love the Nintendo 3DS's launch, but most people apparently didn't. So over in Japan on February 26, 2011, the 3DS launched for, tell me if this sounds familiar, 25,000 yen, or 29,522 yen, or $241. And the launch was, well, it was muted from a sales standpoint. But Nintendo stayed strong and launched the 3DS in America on March 27, 2011 for $250, or $355 in 2025 money. Well, it turns out that price point really wasn't compatible with the market. And after several stressful months, Nintendo revised the standard price to $170, or $238 by today's standards. If you were an early adopter like myself, you were given a handful of NES and Game Boy Advance games that were never released on the 3DS again, which is, I guess it's nice, but I kind of feel bad for those people who actually want these games. Oh boy, we're finally here, the Wii U. Go ahead and brag in the comments if you owned a Wii U. I know I did. Launching on November 18th, 2012 in North America, that means we got it first. Thanks. The Wii U saw a tiering price bracket, which was popular at the time. The deluxe edition saw a much bigger hard drive and Nintendo Land for $350, which is $482.95 in today's money. They also included included a thriftier option for $299 or $414 in today's money. So how did Nintendo's first console over $300 go? Not well. In Japan, the console sold for 37,214 yen for the deluxe set or 26,250 yen for the basic set, which is $252 and $210 respectively. Again, the Wii U sold terribly in its lifetime. In fact, it was discontinued months before its successor. So there was a good month when Nintendo simply didn't have a home console. Always a good sign. Well, choo-choo, we're at our final destination before we get to guessing with the Nintendo Switch in 2017. This is so far our first and only worldwide launch, and that's a point that we really shouldn't overlook. Nintendo was able to launch on a singular date on March 3rd, 2017, and it must be noted this is where we saw the end of the handheld and console divisions. Instead, they combined their efforts onto one platform, which launched for $299.99 in North America, or $391 by inflation standards, and 29,980 yen, or 33,960 yen in 2025 standards, which currently exchanges for $231. Now, before we go any further, it should be noted that as of this writing, the Nintendo Switch currently retails for, you guessed it, $300, which means no price drop over the course of 8 years. In fact, the eventual OLED model added 0 features besides the material of the screen itself. Nonetheless, that too retails for $350 as of the time of this writing. Okay, team, we've reached the end of what we know, the hard facts and details. Now we're going to be entering the guessing zone, where we can guess the price of the next Nintendo console, in this case the Switch 2. We'll be using the data that we just went over, as well as some other historical references to argue a price point. Of course, we all want the Switch 2 to be really affordable, but let's look at the numbers and see what makes sense. First and foremost, we have to recognize the global commerce system of exchange, which has sadly put Japan's yen on the back foot, losing value to the American dollar's buying power. In fact, it's at one of its weakest points since the Great Recession of the 1990s sent the Japanese economy into several unexpected directions. That's not to say the American dollar has been steady by any means. As we can see just from the Switch alone, inflation has been significant over the past several years, greatly reducing the American dollar's buying power. Now, for the sake of argument, let's have a look at the newest console launch in Japan, albeit a revision of another console. The PlayStation 5 Pro launched for 119,980 yen, or around $816. Japan has a long history of luxury video game consoles, so I don't want to generalize. However, when it comes to Nintendo consoles, there continues to be an expectation of affordability, perhaps because of how their properties connect with younger audiences and families. Even the luxury OLED Nintendo Switch released for 37,980 yen. Perhaps Nintendo was testing the psychological waters of a 40,000 yen console. But again, this is a console made for enthusiasts rather than the general audience. Now, it might seem simple enough to take a look at the competition like the PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X for how much the Switch 2 will cost. But again, there's not always correlation. For instance, the GameCube and Switch were both $100 less than the PlayStation and Xbox of their respective generations. And it's also worth noting that the PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X include a pricey Blu-ray disc drive at their $500 variation. Meanwhile, the Xbox Series S, which saw some success in Japan, launched at $300. And the PlayStation 5 without a disc drive launched at $400, but has since seen a price increase by $50. So $400 might seem like the safe bet. But again, this would only be possible with Nintendo's extensive history with withering technology. Currently, we know Nintendo is working with Nvidia on a revision of the Tegra chipset, which powers the first generation of Nintendo Switches. Nintendo uses this method for 2 reasons. One, the tech has already been proven with plenty of development and refinement to make it even more developer-friendly. And 2, it's really thrifty. Nintendo is able to sell consoles for cheaper if the market is rough, or see a higher return if the market is in their favor. If Nintendo is planning on launching a console in 2025, it's gonna need a standout price, which is why my guess for the price of the Switch 2 will be $400, making it once again the cheapest console in its generation. Well, if you don't count the Xbox Series S. At first, I was under the assumption Nintendo would never go past $300, especially after the Wii U debacle, but the Switch 2 has seen several influencing factors. First of all, as anyone on social media can tell you, the consumer is greatly aware of what the Switch 2 is, and that's a new console. Sadly for the Wii U, there was plenty of confusion around what the console meant for the generation. and that held it back from a wider audience. I believe the Switch 2's naming scheme won't encounter this same issue, because seriously, who doesn't know what a Part 2 is? But really, it's the inflation and exchange rate that has me convinced. But with the original 2017 Switch hovering just below $400 with inflation, it's safe to say Nintendo will still clear a profit on every unit sold while offering a relatively good deal for consumers with hopefully plenty of support. If patterns are to be believed, that is. But even outside of Nintendo's strategic preferences, the weakness of the yen and the power of the dollar and the recent pattern of inflation points directly to a $400 price tag for the Nintendo Switch 2. But what do you think? How about letting us know how much you would pay for a Switch 2 in the comments below? Or do you think we'll get different pricing tiers? Or how about later revisions? And how many Nintendo consoles have you purchased so far? Let us know in the comments below. Keep clicking around here on Game Rant, and we'll see you next time. Thanks, everybody.